The honourable member for Richmond Hill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise with regard to Bill C-23. And I want to say, first of all, that this side of the House has been and continues to be supportive of positive free trade initiatives. And obviously, looking at the Colombian situation, there are a number of questions that have arisen, and I want to say that, first of all, I've had the opportunity both to meet with President Uribe and his trade minister last June, and we had, I think, a very thorough and a very frank discussion on a number of issues, particularly dealing with human rights. And it is absolutely critical that those issues be addressed to the satisfaction not only of parliamentarians, but of Canadians and certainly of Colombians. And I think in those discussions, we certainly looked at those issues in terms of what's happening with the drug lords, who are unfortunately taking advantage of innocent civilians, and we've seen murders take place. We've seen the government try and certainly deal with the paramilitary. But at the same time, these abuses are still going on, and there's much more work to do. I met earlier this year, Mr. Speaker, with a number of civil society organizations from Colombia when they were here in Canada. Brother Omar Fernandez Obregon, for example, the leader of the Movement for Christians for Peace and Justice. With Yolanda Vega, a well-known human rights defender and leader of the women's movement in Colombia. And of course, their message was very clear. They are concerned about the impact that if we're going to have a free trade agreement with Colombia, what is going to change in terms of both the human rights situation, which happens to be a central tenet of Canadian foreign policy, the protection of the individual, and at the same time ensuring that the quality of life, the betterment of people that they represent and Colombians in general will improve. And what can Canada do if, in fact, a free trade agreement is enacted? Well, they obviously had concerns about what was happening with the current government. There continues to be a high level of violence in Colombia, and obviously wanted to make me, and I'm sure other parliamentarians, aware of that, and certainly concerned about the effect that it's having on Indigenous people, the effect it's having on farmers, and how can a free trade agreement help to deal with that kind of situation. There's a fear of loss of cultural identity. And I commend the International Committee, the Standing Committee dealing with international trade, in terms of their evaluation. Obviously, we have got to look at, and our party, I think, very strongly believes that it needs to go to committee. But a very thorough airing of all of the issues, particularly on human rights, and the benefits that will accrue to Colombians and obviously to Canadians. How will that, in fact, be measured? And measuring it, Mr. Speaker, is extremely important. And therefore, I think the kind of hearings that we need to have, both here, across the country, going back to Colombia, will be important in terms of ensuring that we just don't want any deal. We want a deal that's going to, in fact, be beneficial to both sides and certainly to enhance human rights. Because when we were the government, Mr. Speaker, we made a free trade agreement with Chile. The central element of that happened to be on the issue of human rights. We wanted to ensure that human rights were protected, but also that human rights, in fact, that people walked the talk. And therefore, engaging is important, and that is, of course, why the members of this caucus, and certainly support of our trade critic, was very important in meeting with Mr. Uribe, and to ask the tough questions to him. And obviously we are concerned on this side about any change in the Constitution in which he would want to run again on the pretext that this would certainly, in his view, help Colombians, because we are concerned about labor issues. We're concerned about the state of unions and the fact that unions' growth in Colombia is less than 5%. That obviously is a concern. So if we can engage constructively and help both civil society and, of course, the government of Colombia, that would be very helpful. And so the Parliamentary Standing Committee on International Trade has recommended that human rights impact assessment be carried out. And we certainly, and I would certainly advocate that the United Nations Commissioner on Human Rights be invited to the Standing Committee. I think we need to get all possible avenues evaluated in terms of this situation. The mechanism is important in terms of what we are going to be doing to assess progress in any free trade agreement, and particularly in the area of human rights. And whether that was in Chile, Mr. Speaker, or whether that is even evaluation on an EU agreement, is to look at what we said we are going to do and have we been able to live up to that. And that's why I think that transparency and clarity is extremely important in any bilateral discussions. And obviously that needs to be looked at. We need to have a periodic review but the opportunity for parliamentarians who speak for Canadians to be able to invite trade unionists, to invite business, to invite all sorts of organizations to evaluate very clearly this is going to be important, because I think this is going to have an impact when we're dealing with other regimes. And obviously other states have looked at Colombia very carefully and have gone through a very important evaluation progress in order to ensure that, in fact, this is carried out. When I met with Maria Burgess, who is organizing unions in Colombia, she said they're very challenging times and very threatening times. And we, of course, as a society that certainly we have unions. We have unions which represent workers in this country. We want to make sure that the ability to organize is, in fact, a part of that. In fact, one of the things we have said, and this was certainly outlined very clearly in side agreements dealing with labor and cooperation and environment, was the right of freedom of association, the right for collective bargaining, the abolition of child labor, the elimination of forced and compulsory labor, and the elimination of discrimination. So we welcome the ability for the Standing Committee to have those thorough discussions. As I said, an agreement that is not based on strong human rights evaluation and is not based on certain human right guarantees is no agreement. We want to make sure we have that in place, and we want to make sure that we address the issues that have been raised, not only by human rights organizations, but by union leaders, by others in Colombia. We want to make sure that that is done, and I think the way to do that, Mr. Speaker, is to have an evaluation that this committee can do. But also, some of my colleagues have gone to Colombia, and certainly we have, I don't think, left any stone unturned in terms of making sure that we get answers. Now, in some cases, Mr. Speaker, as you know, you get an answer and that leads to another question. And when the President of Colombia is here, it raised a lot of questions. I won't say that we were satisfied. If we were satisfied, there'd be no need to go and have detailed hearings. But I think we need to make sure that we get an agreement which is in the best interest of workers both in this country and in Colombia. It has to be a win-win situation, both for the Colombians and for Canadians alike. We have to ensure that they are walking the talk in terms of what they say in terms of the domestic laws and what they agree to. And obviously, Mr. Speaker, I could go on and deal with issues dealing with the environment. I think, again, it's important that we make sure that we have the highest standards in terms of environmental protection, in terms of what it is that Canadian companies are doing. And, of course, we have and continue to support those, and these side agreements are important. But, again, it's evaluating a year from now, 3 years from now, what has happened with any agreement to make sure that it's being adhered to and being adhered to effectively. And what are the repercussions if, in fact, they are not adhered to? What are we prepared to do if, in fact, they are getting a failing grade or they are not living up to, in fact, what we had adhered to at the time? And I think, again, in speaking to those human rights advocates who came here, they are simply saying, don't rush, make sure that it is done correctly. I didn't hear too many say we don't want an agreement. What they said is, unless we get an agreement which is in the best interest of all, it's not an agreement at all. And I think we have to be very careful as parliamentarians that when we are calling our witnesses, that these witnesses come forward, they give us their frank and honest assessments. But again, often, Mr. Speaker, it's useful for parliamentarians to go to unfettered, to go to Colombia and to be able to talk to those parliamentarians, to talk to those members of civil society and get the kind of answers that they're looking for to come back and certainly put forth a comprehensive report. So I welcome the fact that we're going to hopefully move on that front, and I do hope that not just parliamentarians but people in general will certainly send in their views and will be able to get an agreement that we can be proud of and that will benefit Colombian society as a whole. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.